Welcome back to my in-depth look at Topaz Labs Impressions, part of Topaz Studio 2. This is Joe Jasper, and you're watching Joe Jasper Video. We've had the intro, and now you're going to have more video clips to round out your lesson. Before actually diving into a painting, let's optimize an image before applying an impression. Removing distracting elements tends to improve your results, so simplify or replace the background, apply other filters like basic adjustments, curves, edges, glow, remove noise, sharpen for realism. Here's an example with a bride and a too busy background versus a nice clean background, and this affects the results when we compare side by side. Too busy versus nice and clean. And I think you can appreciate some difference here. So even after your painting is done, you really should think about the same kind of thing. Are there distracting elements that could be saved with some cloning out or toning down? And then after the impression, also think about, do you want to apply some precision contrast or detail or toning those things down? Would it benefit from some texture? Maybe applying a color lookup table or a wash, doing some dodging and burning, or even running through Gigapixel. I've had Gigapixel emphasize the brush strokes for me, and so it's something to keep in the back of your mind that there's much more you can do with your image even after you think the painting is done. You've probably already tried your hand at some paintings, but if you have a deeper understanding of what the brushes are, how to use the different ones, and adjust all the sliders and things that go along with an impression filter, your results will probably be much better. As I demonstrate these settings in detail, I might get a little bogged down and slow down, so feel free to speed up your playback. Okay, this is Joe Jasper, again looking into Topaz Studio Impression, and we're going to start with the first brush. And I've chosen this short-eared owl photo of mine because it has this interesting combination of larger features of the whole bird, medium-sized features of the eyes, beak, and then finer feathers in the acoustic disc that are going in all sorts of different directions. And we'll see how Topaz handles that. And we're going to start out with the very first brush. So I've duplicated layers here. I'm going to pause while I open Topaz Studio 2, but to show you how to do that, first make sure you have a duplicated layer. I'm working out of Photoshop. I go to Filter, Topaz Studio 2. Okay, and now here we are. I'm going to zoom in to 200% because what I see on my screen is different from yours, and this way you should be able to follow along. We may even go in a little wider. But let's focus. Here we'll get a little bit of the face and some of the wing, and we'll go to Add Filter and down to Impression. Now this is going in via filters. You can also access a lot of painterly effects through Add Look. But this way we'll get to explore precisely just what impression is doing. So the first brush is the one that defaults to Type 1 brush. So Type 1 brush. And what we want to do is work from top to bottom here, choose a brush style, and explore what this brush can do. First we come across the number of strokes, low, medium, and high, which goes from larger and fewer strokes to high and finer detail. Experiment with them in high, and we're just getting more and more detail. Here depends on the degree of realism you want in your photo. The next thing down is the brush size. You'll see that brush size affects not just the size of the brush, but often the coverage as well. So let's take the brush size down, and you see that it's not covering the whole canvas. One way around this, if you and let's also look at it on low, is to go down to texture. You probably all know this trick already, and go to the very bottom and click on original, and now you see that with a very small brush, basically we're just seeing the photograph. So coming back up, let's increase that brush size until we are covering a good portion of the canvas. And then the next thing I want to do is look at paint volume. So by increasing paint volume, we're starting to see more contrast in the brush strokes. So if you're trying to do an impasto type of painting where you have heavy brush strokes and the reflections and shadows of those brush strokes, then you would want that high. Let's put this one to medium. The other thing you can see is that we started to fill in some of the voids by increasing the paint volume. I prefer to do that more with the paint opacity. We'll see in a sec. One thing that we also see is there's a choice for the volume on just the large brush volume. I'll show you the difference in brush sizes that Impression is choosing for us right in a sec, but just realize that in these big peripheral areas where there's no detail, it's going to choose a larger brush size, and so we have a choice of paint volume for that area, and you can see it's not really affecting the face versus affecting the face and the large brush. If we have them both up, we get something that looks like that. So let's put these both down a little bit and now look at paint opacity. Again, we have some voids, but as the paint opacity comes in, we tend to fill that in. Let's see how small we can make the brush size if we put the paint opacity all the way up. So we're still limited with this brush, if we want complete coverage of the canvas, to a brush size of 0.3. How does that do for our little owl? So looking at his face, we have quite a bit of detail. We're going to look closer at that. The wing looks great to me. The background, you know, it's up to you how much contrast and all you want in your paint. You know, do you want a lot? Or do you want a little? I think that looks very painterly, but maybe more contrast than I'd want. I'm going to zoom in on this face even more because there's a story to tell here about what good things Topaz Studio is doing here. So remember the acoustic disc. If we click on original for a second, the feathers of the acoustic disc here, the face, are going out radially. And some paint programs just choose one direction or haphazard directions for your brush strokes. But what we're getting here is that those brush strokes are actually going in the direction of the detail, which I think is pretty phenomenal. So here I have put a split view in for you, and you can see the original. Again, this is over 500%, so nothing you would normally look at, but you can see the paintbrush strokes and painterly effect versus the photograph. Okay. Coming back out to 300%, let's keep going down the list here a little bit. So, you know, I may like these first few settings, leave them alone. What about stroke rotation? So let's kind of watch these couple of areas as I increase stroke rotation. It's telling the brush to tilt a little bit more clockwise, which doesn't do us any good for the acoustic disc, right? It's kind of mucking it up. So 0 is where I would want to keep it if I have something of fine detail that I don't want to make abstract. Rotation variation is sort of similar. Let's turn it all the way up. And we get more of this spattered look where someone has made haphazard strokes. Now, one of the things one can do, because I kind of like that on the background, but I don't like it on the face as much, is do 2 layers of impression, one for the bird and one for the background. But let's take that rotation back down. It's all to your taste, so you can do what you want. Stroke color variation depends how literal you want things, but watch this background area, what happens to it. It's almost like a prism is splitting the colors of the rainbow out of this painting, right? It's pretty wild. Now that's great if you're doing Monet water lily. Maybe we'll see that later in my presentation. But for now, let's keep it closer to 0. A little bit of variation is nice. As I was mentioning, Impressionists may like that because as light reflects off of a surface or through the sky, rainbow, think rainbow, or reflections off of a pond, you do get some variation. And I think that is sometimes a nice thing to put a little bit of that in. Now stroke width and length can be varied too. So let's increase the stroke width, and you can see we're getting gobbier, thicker strokes. You can look here at this stroke, and then you can look over here. So I'm going to turn up the stroke width and turn down the stroke width. And you can see if I turn it all the way down, we're getting to like the finest pen that you can think of, right? We can do the same thing with stroke length. Turn it down versus turning it up. And we're just getting a different expression of what that brush is doing. Of course, as we go down, we may be losing some coverage. So let's turn both of these up and then go back to the brush size. And you can see now we're coming much lower with the brush size, and yet by adjusting the stroke width and length, we're back to basically where we were before. So you can play with that and say, you know, I kind of like shorter strokes, and find where you run into a problem, but nice fat brush, and then increase the brush size, or that little trick with texture original until you eliminate the coverage deficits. So now in the case of this, where I want the feathers to be emphasized a little bit more, the length, you know, that are long skinny things, I'd probably choose something like this, balance it out, and then maybe go up to the brush and get closer to that 30 mark that we know, till we see there, right at 20, we've eliminated the gaps in the coverage. So that's where we are with that. Now we get into some other interesting things. Spill and smudge. So often if you look at a painting around the edges of something, you'll see where the artist may have gone beyond, or that you get some kind of blending with a neighboring stroke. So here, if my spill is very low, I get a more realistic fine look, and here is essentially the 0 setting, and up here we get the rougher look of strokes overlapping each other more. So let's leave that at 0 and then turn up the smudge. Now watch what happens just going to 1, 0.01. We get this liquid lines kind of look, right? It's a thinner paint blending with the stroke next to it. That's just at 0.01. I think we could have had a nicer amount of blending here, because now as we go up even to 50%, it's really wild. It makes for an interesting picture, but I would like to see from 0 to 10 be a lot, or 0 to 50 be a lot more gradual in the effect that it gives. So I almost always leave that off unless I'm going for something that looks more liquid. The coverage is how much of the canvas you want your effect to take. So let's go back to single view. Here's the entire canvas. If I take my coverage way down to like 13, you can see the edges are looking like they're not covered. So, you know, a sidewalk sketch artist or something doesn't cover the whole canvas. And the transition of that coverage will show you
pretty well if you want to focus it on your subject. Boom. And then spread it out a little bit more gently. And I do use this more for sketches than for paintings. So that's all those settings. Now if we put that back to 100%, color is HSL. So the same things that you've had elsewhere. If I wanted to get this greenish tint to be a different hue, I'd click on the green and I could change that to a warmer tone that might be more consistent with the rest of the picture. I could take the overall hue and change it a little more towards the red end, or cool it down a little more in this direction. So that's pretty standard stuff for all you. Lighting, brightness, contrast, highlight, shadow. So if you are going for a chiaroscuro, very highlighted highlights, you know, a lot of contrast in the picture, you could do something like this. And if you were looking for something flatter, you could maybe take those in the opposite direction, right? So it's all up to you, to personal taste when we're getting down to these things. I'm going to re-zero these by double-clicking on the titles of each adjustment. Light position is basically where's the light affects supposedly how the light reflects off of those paint strokes and may give you a different look. Vignetting, obvious. Put a vignette around. Oops, wrong thing here. Come down here and you want to move your vignette to highlight your subject more. And you can adjust the strength of it. The transition, you bring a transition down to 0 and you get to see how big or small your vignette is, right? So, and then I can center it on my subject, bring my vignette transition back up, and then adjust the strength to where I want it to make that owl pop out a little bit more. Texture is next. And so if you don't see it open, you come down, you see this little drop down arrow, open texture, and choose what you want. This is Canvas 1 is often my favorite for oils, which is basically what this is, oil or acrylic maybe. And if we zoom in so you can see the texture, right now the texture is set to 0 strength. So I have to bring that texture up, and now you can see little bumps. I'll make it real big for you guys, appearing as if paint has been caught in the little dimples of texture. I can turn that, make that texture larger so that you can see it better and also get an appreciation for what we're doing here, and then just adjust it to taste to make it realistic. Plus it gives it more dimensionality, you know, so I think it's good to put some texture on your painterly things. So I'm not saying this is perfect in the way I would necessarily leave this painterly effect. I think we need a little more large brush volume, so let's go back up there to make it look a little more realistic, somewhere in here. And then what I usually would do is do this first for the bird, then come back and do it again for the background to taste, and mask where I want more detail for the bird. This is an example of using the 2 layers of impression. The first layer is at high detail with a high number of strokes and small brush to get the detail out of the bird and the limb. And the second layer over that is the same brush except at low number of strokes and a larger brush size.
So we've seen brush number 1 and adjusted all the sliders to see what they can do. Now it's time to move on to see what the other brushes are, and you can play with the settings on your own images.